Acredito que a América Latina tem futuro muito brilhante e estou muito contente de estar aqui hoje. Infelizmente, meu português é muito ruim, então farei minha apresentação em inglês. Obrigado. So let's start by talking a bit about me, so I can introduce myself. My name is Aimonetti, and I was born in France, from a French-Italian dad and a Spanish North African mom, and I now live in San Diego in California. Some of my friends define me as a morally loose, cheese-eating, surrender monkey, but that's really not the reason why I'm here today. The reason why I'm here today is because I love Ruby, and I believe you do too. I love Ruby, and I was involved in many projects for many years now, and there's at least one you should know, which is Merb. And since I've been involved with Merb merged with Rails, and this is coming not as a big news, but Rails 3 is coming up really soon. And it's going to be the best Rails version ever. But apart from that, I spend a lot of time working on CouchDB. I work on CouchDB for professional projects I'm involved with, so I really like this project. And on my free time, I also work on a project called MacRuby, which is an open source project which is led by Apple. And tomorrow morning, Rich Kilmer is going to do a presentation at 9 a.m. So I would really want to encourage you to come. Actually, there's also Marcos does a presentation on CouchDB tomorrow too, right? What time is it? Do you know? Tomorrow afternoon, good. So anyway, that was about me. Let's talk about the future, because that's the main topic of this talk. But if we talk about the future, we need to actually give a definition. We need to explain what the future is. So I went on Wikipedia, and I found one definition of your future. So the future, according to Wikipedia, is a time period commonly understood to contain all events that have yet to occur. And this is something that's very important, because you need to realize that what we're going to talk about is what we think will happen. But in the past, a lot of people got it wrong. We don't have robots cleaning up the house. If we talk about the World Cup, you might think that, well, Brazil is going to win the World Cup. But really, what will happen is that France is going to win. Well, maybe. Let's hope so. Or maybe not. I don't know. Anyway, talking about the future, let's talk about Rails and Rails 3, which I really believe is the future of web development. And if you're here today, you probably share the same vision as I do. So Rails. Rails 3 is a natural evolution of a web framework. There was a big merge between Rails and Merb, and we're just going to go quickly through that and explain how that affects you as developers. My talk is not going to be a very technical talk where I'm going to go in details and show you how the internals were changed. What I'm going to try to show you is how this new version of Rails is going to change your life as a web developer, and what's the new perspective on things. So let's look at the audience of Rails, Rails 2 in this case. So the main audience were app developers, application developers. Then we had the entrepreneurs that wanted a web framework that was fast to develop on and that was very effective. And then we also had the designers. On the other hand, in the Merb camp, we had the same goal of reaching the app developers, but we were targeting a bit more the enterprise market and the plugin authors. So the good news is that now with Rails 3, we just combine all this audience, and we can get them all together instead of letting people choose what they want to do, if they want to use Rails or Merb. In this case, with Rails 3, you're going to be able to get everything you want. So let's also look at the principles. The principles of Rails 2 were programmer happiness, That's a very strong principle that I believe is the reason why a lot of people switch to Rails. There's also a very strong concept of conventions, and there's a need for fluent design. Merb, on the other hand, was targeting the programmer happiness, but that's a typo, that's programmer happiness. Otherwise, it was flexibility. We wanted to give you as many choices as you could, so you could adapt the framework to your project instead of going the other way. Modularity, so you could take and replace small parts everywhere. And then speed, which was another big one. Well, the good news is with Rails 3, we're going to get all of that, and probably even more. So that's kind of a shift. I think Rails always had this concept somewhere, but they were not as important as they're going to be in Rails 3. And what's also very important is for people who've been using Rails for a long time, actually things will not change much for you. You will still get everything you love in Rails, but if you want to get something else, you will get what Merb is going to provide you as part of Rails 3. Something else, though, that needed to change for this merge to happen was the atomic structure of Rails. And if you look at the atomic structure, if we would represent Rails atomic structure for Rails 2, it would look something like that, an atomic nucleus. So basically, we have this atom, and we have small parts, but they're really close together, and they work very well as one unit, very powerful unit. But if you wanted to make some changes, it was doable, but it was a bit challenging. So the change was made to switch to more of an atomic cluster, where we still have one unit that works very well together, but you can take parts and you can replace them without having to break down everything at once. Also around, at the center of this atomic cluster is Rock. And the Rails stack ended up being a bit like a spinal cord or a spinal column. You basically have your stack and everything else connects to it. And we have a lot of different elements that allow you to actually connect more stuff, different things, to get more flexibility, and to get the flexibility and speed that Merb were providing, we're still getting the easiness and the pleasure you had to use Rails. The other big advantage of building this skeleton is that you can just generate a normal skeleton the way you were doing it before, but if you want the skeleton to be slightly different, you can easily create your own skeleton based on this stack. So that's a lot of concept. Let's look a bit more in details what's new in Rails 3. So one of the major changes is the router. The router, you might not really realize what it is when you use Rails. The router is basically what helps you when you go to the metro or the underground or the tube. You are trying to go to a certain place, but you're not really sure how to. So usually what you do is you look at a map. This is the map of the metro in Paris, and I can tell you it's not easy for a foreigner to find its way. And every city has its own color, every city has its own code, and it's not always easy to find its way. So the role of the router is basically to tell the request, when there's a request coming, this is where you need to go to. So based on some characteristics, you're going to go and point to a certain action in a certain controller. And this is what the router does. The problem is every single framework was just reinventing its own router. And you had different options, you could do it a different way, and we're having a bit of a challenge to have one way of doing the router. So instead of fighting, we decided to give some Rock love. And what happened is that Rock, first, do you guys know what Rock is? Can I see? Okay, so let me explain Rock quickly. When you have a request coming to your web stack, it will hit the web server, and then it will go through Rock to be converted into a uniform standard request that will go and hit your application, and the application will route this request to an action and a controller. So rack is basically just an interface that will convert and use one standard format. What that means is that now, if you use rack, you can connect different rack parts or rack compatible parts together, and they would work together very well. So by using a rack router, you can reuse this router and get Sinatra and Rails working together, for instance. Or you can use a middleware that was written for another web framework written in Ruby and reuse it in Rails. So we're getting a nice standardized API for the router and for any request coming in. So the requests coming in now come into a standard format. So that gives us a lot of option in the router. We have, for instance, a new concept of constraints and filters. And a simple example would be this example. Might be a bit hard to read. But basically, when the request comes in, the request has a lot of different characteristics. For instance, you will know what kind of HTTP format is being used. Is it an HTTP request, or is it an HTTPS request? So are we using SSL? You can look at the user agent. Is the user coming from an iPhone, or is the request coming from Firefox? If it's coming from the iPhone, for instance, I might redirect or use a different view. In this example, what we do is we actually look at the IP address of the request. And based on the IP address, we're going to reroute this request to a specific controller and a specific action. So what we do is we say, if the request comes from 192.168.1 something, then you can route /admin to the dashboard controller index action. You can do a lot of more stuff like that now with the new router. Another example is how you can mount different rack apps together. So you can integrate two different applications together. And this is a mock example of what you will be able to do in Rails 3. We define a namespace. We load a middleware that might do something. We don't really know what here. And then we're going to match /game to a Sinatra app. And Sinatra is used a lot by Facebook apps. A lot of people use Sinatra for their Facebook games. And in this case, you could have a normal app and just take your small Sinatra app and mount it and put it into the namespace and match it directly, do that in the router. So a lot of potential. You could also do that with what's being called the mountable apps. So let's imagine you're writing an app. Let's say you're writing a forum Rails application. So you have your forum, it's great, you're using on site A, but then you want to reuse it on site B, which already has a blog. Because you have two different applications, that means you need to use twice more resource because you need to start more web processors or mongrels or whatever you want to use. Well, with Rails 3, what you will be able to do is to define your Rails application. So you can say my forum actually inherits from Rails application, and the application has all the router information, the middleware stack, the controllers, it configures the app classes, and this way you can reuse your application and mount it inside another application. So if you wrote a blog application, you can actually mount it into your e-commerce website, or actually you can mount both of them in a different application, and you can take a calendar you wrote, a calendar app, and put it in, and have all of that working together. So the router is becoming really, really powerful, and will give you all the options you already have now, and many more if you want to push things further. Another new thing with Rails 3 is active workers. And this is a work in progress. But basically the concept is that often you want to do something in a different thread, or you want to do something that's not running into the application. A very simple example is you have a user sending you an email, or filling up a form, clicking submit, and you want to send them an email. The problem is if you put that into your action, you need to wait until the email has been dispatched so you can return the response to the user. And that can take a few seconds. Another example is when you upload a file. Let's say a user uploads an image and you need to resize it, or you need to recompress it, or you need to convert it. You need to wait until this process is done before you can actually return a response to the user, which means that you're basically wasting time on the client side. So with the active workers, what you're going to be able to do is to define some task that would run in the background, and then you'll be able to just push them to the queue, and there will be a different thread that will take care of them and handle that. And that's what we call background processing. It's not an advanced background processing like you would get with DJ, but it's a very simple thing that should make your apps much cleaner, separate the logic better, and make the response time better in a lot of cases. Another really nice thing with Rails 3 is the unobtrusive JavaScript approach. I guess everybody recognized Dunga. This is basically a very interesting step forward. Basically, you will be able to really become your app's coach. You're going to be able to select your players. You're going to be able to say, I want this instead of this. And, well, we're going to use HTML5. And HTML5 has a new attribute called data-something. And with this attribute, you can insert data into your DOM and reprocess it. So what that will allow us to do is to, we're going to render your template and you're going to use helpers, instead of writing prototype JavaScript inside your view, we're going to insert this HTML5 data attributes, and then we're going to be able to let you use whatever tool you want. So if you want a player like jQuery, you can really use that. If you want to use Dojo, if you want to use MooTools, you can be able to do that. And the way it's going to work is that we're going to generate these HTML5 attributes, and then we're going to generate a JSON data node. And the API layer in JavaScript will be able to read this data and convert it to whatever library you use. So, for instance, if you have a link remote 2 right now, it creates a JavaScript that only works on prototype. Well, with Rails 3, it's going to generate an HTML that will have all the information for JavaScript to process that and put the link and get the link processed by the JavaScript library. So for instance, you might have a data-URL that's going to be used for the link. And Rails is going to come with a lot of small adapters. So it's still a work in progress. So I don't know exactly how it's going to be. If you're going to have to use that in your template and inject and have this API layer adapter for your JavaScript library added, or if it's going to come with it. But we're going to be able to support all the major JavaScript libraries, and you're going to be able to actually use a new one if you just want to write the interface for it. Another big thing for Rails 3 is the ORM agnosticity. You might not really realize the need for that. You might be really happy with Active Record. But Active Record is the standard ORM in Rails. And an ORM is basically what converts your data storage information into your variables in your programming language. So the ORM goes this transaction back and forth, and most people use Active Record. Active Record is actually going to get better and better. First, it's still the default, so if you're going to install Rails 3, it will still come with Active Record, and it will still work the way it was working before. But some people are working on a project called Active Relation, which might not make it to 3 though, but it will probably make it to 3.1 or something later. And basically, instead of using strings inside Active Record, so the way Active Records works is when you do model.find conditions, blah, 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 it creates a string, which is the query that gets sent to the database through the driver. Well, the problem is with the string, you're kind of limited in what you do. You cannot wait until the last minute to process it. There's a lot of things you cannot do. So instead of using strings, Active Relation is going to use objects. And this, we're going to get even more flexibility inside Active Record, and we're going to be able to optimize your queries. There's also the Common API. So Active Record is the default, and therefore there's a project called the Active Model that lets you map any ORM to accept more or less the same underlying API queries as Active Record. So if you do 2 params, for instance, it will work on different adapters. And because of that, we're going to be able to switch and use any adapter, any ORM we want, and we don't have to use Active Record. There are also people working on data object interface, and that's another project I'm not going to talk about today. An ORM that was the default ORM for Merb is called Data Mapper. Data Mapper is a very interesting ORM. It's not as mature as Active Record, but it's very interesting, and I'm not going to go into the details of Data Mapper because it's an entirely different talk, but I want to show you when you might want to consider using Data Mapper. First case is when you have legacy repositories. So let's imagine you're migrating a PHP application to Rails. And you have this legacy database you still need to use, but you cannot rename it to match the Active Record conventions. You have ways to do it in Active Record, but Data Mapper offers a very nice mapping where you can use a new database and the old database, and you can just say this old field matches this new field, and when you have this, you modify it to that, and a lot of different nice ways of mapping, and Data Mapper is great for that. I personally use that very often when I do a migration. So what I do is I take all my data from whatever application I add, whatever database, and I convert it into the new format and just migrate all the data over. And I usually just use a script to do that. It works great. You can map also between one database to the other. So if you were using MySQL, you can copy data from MySQL to Postgres, or from Oracle to MySQL, and stuff like that. Also, it's really nice when you have to deal with multiple repositories. This is not a case that a lot of people have to deal with, but I had to deal with that when, for instance, you use 3 different databases. And you don't want to write 3 different models, you just want the model to use the appropriate database based on the conditions. Data Mapper does that very well. Query optimization, so that's also a very interesting concept. It's a bit like active relation I was explaining before. Data Mapper waits until the last second to generate your query. So instead of generating a lot of queries, very often it will only generate one query because you will be able to understand what we're trying to do. If you do animal.find.all, well, it would be actually animal.all.cats.first. If you use Active Record and you don't know how to actually use magic trick, it would generate at least 2 queries. With Data Mapper, because we can analyze the query, it will only generate 1 query. So there's a lot of very interesting query optimization going on in Data Mapper that hopefully will also make it in Active Record. Finally, a big major point for Data Mapper is that it's not an SQL-based system. It works very well with SQL, but it's meant to map any type of data stores. So you can use the file system, you can use IMAP, you can use a REST API. I wrote an adapter for Google Video. I think it was less than 200 lines. And basically, you use the same API, but instead of querying the database, it queries a remote REST service. So very interesting project that you might consider to use with Rails 3. The other ORM I want to talk about today is SQL. SQL is not very well known. It's used a lot by some of the Sinatra lovers. SQL is actually a very interesting project if you have specific needs, especially prepared statements. And a lot of people using Oracle have to use prepared statements. In the case of MySQL, it doesn't always make a lot of sense. I would personally not recommend to do it, but in some instances you need to use prepared statements, and SQL is really great at that. It's also really great at sharding. It supports sharding. And it's great for highly customizable SQL work. And this is really where SQL shines, is when you need to do very low-level SQL work to optimize all your queries. SQL is, for instance, used by Yellow Pages in the US. They use SQL to query their databases to be really, really quick and to optimize all their queries. And performance is obviously one of the major points for SQL. And finally, because of active model and because of this approach of the ORM that's much more open now, you can actually have any type of ORM to just work directly with Rails 3. So if you want to write your ORM for data core, you can actually do it as long as you follow some of the conventions. So you're going to map some of the methods that are working right now that are expected by Rails. So for instance, you need to be able to do a to model, and you need to be able to do a few things like that. So anyway, whatever ORM you want to use, you'll be able to use it with Rails 3, which is great news. Finally, all of that is really, was really possible because we did a lot of internal cleanup. And by we, I mean mainly Yehuda Katz, Carl Lurch, Josh Peak, Pratik, and everybody else working on the team really worked hard to clean things up. Mainly the parts that really needed to be cleaned up. Because you need to realize Rails is, what, 5 years old now? And some of the code has been there for 5 years. People have been hacking on it. And there was a real need to clean things up so we can optimize things. And the best way of showing the result is to actually look at performance. And what we wanted to do is to get an old Maradona and get a young Pelé instead, right? So that was kind of the idea of the cleanup. And before I came here, I did some benchmarks. And you need to know that you should never trust benchmarks. Benchmarks are not a right way of you cannot say because the benchmarks show that Rails is 50 times faster, then my app's going to be 50 times faster. So anyway, I still did the benchmarks, and I benchmarked the critical path of Rails. So we're talking about dispatching a request all the way to rendering. And I tried different things. The project is online if you want to actually run the benchmarks. And what I did is I benchmarked Rails 2.3 with Ruby 1.8.7, which is what most people should use now. And I compared it with Rails 3 with Ruby 1.9. And the reason why I did that is not to get fake numbers. It's because I think that most people are going to do this switch. They really should switch to Ruby 1.9, and Rails 3 is going to be optimized for Ruby 1.9. And I think this should give you a good idea of what kind of performance boost you're going to see. So doing a simple hello world, which is just rendering the string hello world, I got a 3x, so that's 300 times faster. A normal render is 259x. So we're getting between 2 to 3 times faster, which is huge. That's really incredible. Now, these are my benchmarks on my machine, but Jeremy Camper from the Rails Core team did his own benchmark that he published during Ruby World, and he actually got better result than me. And that's comparing Ruby 1.8 and Ruby 1.9, and he got up to 800%, so 8x, which is huge. Now, that doesn't mean your app's going to be 3 times faster, because if the code you wrote is bad, and that's the main bottleneck, your application will still be slow. What that means is that Rails is probably not going to be the reason why your application is slow anymore. You might have to find the reason. So that's mainly due to cleanup. There's a lot of also optimization and some of the syntax change. There's a lot of small things that I'm not going to go into details, but we have a lot of different talks, and we're going to blog about that, and you will see a lot of information. Now that's it for Rails 3 and the future of Rails, but Rails without Ruby really is not much. So let's talk about Ruby and the future of Ruby. Right now, in the Ruby community, we have a lot of Ruby implementations. And that's actually really, really good news. Until now, or until recently, we had mainly Ruby 1.8. And then we started having JRuby, then we had Ruby 1.9, and now we have a bunch of them. So we have Ruby 1.9, We have Iron Ruby, JRuby, MacRuby, Rubinius, and then in the future we're going to have Ruby 2.0. So my goal today is to show you what they are, what each of them can bring to your projects, and what can we hope for in the future. So I emailed all the different implementators, and I asked them, what are you planning for the future of your implementation? What do you want to see in the future? It might not happen, but what's your dream about it? And all of them were actually very scared of sharing their dream because they don't want to disappoint you. So we're just going to throw some ideas, and things might happen, things might not happen. But let's start by Ruby 1.9. Ruby 1.9, it's basically the recommended Ruby implementation to use with Rails 3. It has better performance, better threading, it has fibers. It's the official Ruby version, and it's really, really the recommended way. There's no reason why you cannot use it right now. There are a few problems with some of the gems and some of the libraries, but nothing that cannot be fixed. And a lot of people already use Ruby 1.9 in production with Rails 2. So I really hope everybody's going to switch to Ruby 1.9 for Rails 3. Just to give you a quick idea, I did another benchmark, and this time I benchmarked just Rails 3, and I benchmarked Ruby 1.8.6, which really you should not use with Rails 3, Ruby Enterprise Edition, and Ruby 1.9. So the base here, 0%, is Ruby 1.8.7, and you can see how much faster Ruby 1.9 is. By just changing the Ruby implementation, you'll get a lot of speed gain. For the record, I did benchmark JRuby, but I had some issues with JRuby because JRuby requires some warm-up time. So JRuby does optimization at runtime. So when you run JRuby, it processes the code and then makes the implementation faster after X amount of times. And to get a decent speed, I had to actually run the benchmark a lot of times. And I thought it was not really fair to put the numbers here. But the benchmarks are available online on github.com/mathethi/rails-simple benchmarks. And you can actually run them with whatever implementation. What I did to run these benchmarks is to just use RVM, which is a project that lets you install different Ruby implementations without messing up your system. And I built all the different Ruby implementation, and I run the benchmarks against them. So I would recommend you give it a try. But I'm sorry I could not put JRuby here. Rubinius should be able to run them, but I didn't have time to run the benchmarks. Rubinius has been doing a lot of performance work, so I would not be surprised to see some really decent work. And MacRuby is not running Rails yet, and Iron Ruby was really, really slow on my Mac using Mono, and I didn't have a Windows machine available, so I could not benchmark that. But I'm sure you would also get some decent results. So the future of Ruby. The future of Ruby is Ruby 2.0. And I talked quickly with Matt before coming here, and I asked him what was his vision. And he said, well, he did not start working on Ruby 2.0, but he should start as soon as Ruby 1.9.2 is released, which I believe is still scheduled for Christmas. Might have changed it, do you know? Yeah, something around Christmas, whenever it's ready. Right now they're trying to pass all the Ruby specs. So Ruby 2.0, Matt told me what he wants to do is really focus on scalability and performance. We're going to be able to use multiple VMs. You're going to be able to use selector namespace. So selector namespace is basically what you will see in MacRuby, where when you use Rails and you send a command, when you call a method, you dispatch a method, sometimes you use a hash, and you say options, and then you pass an array, and then you use another key, and you pass something else. And all of that is basically a big hack we do in Ruby, where we then process the hash and then set the options. When Matt is saying he would like to see that as being part of the language in Ruby 2.0. There are a lot of other things he's planning on doing, but it's really early, and it will take a while before Ruby 2.0 gets released. But it's exciting to see that the Ruby core team is already planning stuff, and we're going to be able to hear about that probably early next year. The other implementation is Iron Ruby. So who does any type of .NET or ASP work? Can I see some hands? Yeah. Oh, I thought we actually would see more. I thought that Brazil had a big ASP community. Well, Ruby is a very interesting project that's led by Microsoft. And the main goal is to do .NET integration. They're planning on doing a Visual Studio integration. And if you ever did any type of .NET work, you know that Visual Studio is a great idea. And being able to do Ruby on Windows with a decent implementation using Visual Studio is actually very exciting. Something else you can do with Ruby is Silverlight, which is kind of the competition for Flash. But everything is written in Ruby. And it's a very cool tool. They have a small light framework that lets you also do some sort of animations. So you might want to look into that. Something really nice with Ruby is you can have a very nice integration with IIS. So if you have any type of .NET application on the web, you can integrate all of that together in a nice way. And of course, you get support from Microsoft, which is just, it's just incredible to see big companies like Microsoft being interested in Ruby and investing time and money in this project. So the future of Ruby was the integration with Visual Studio. Right now they're working on Python integration, and they're going to switch to, they're going to add Ruby in the future. They want to work on better tools, better integration, and better performance. Ruby is not 1.0 yet, so there's still some work to be done, but they should be there in a few months, from what I understood. The other implementation is JRuby. So JRuby is great for any type of Java integration. Basically, who does Java? Who has to deal with Java? Do we have a lot of people? Oh, okay, we do have a lot of people. I'm sure you all love Java, and that's why you're here today, right? So JRuby is awesome because you can just map and integrate Java and Ruby together. You can load your libraries, you can share stuff. It's a really, really interesting project, and you can just use the language you love with the stack you have to deal with, which is not always easy to do. JRuby has also native threads. It has a very nice deployment system with Glassfish, and then you have all the advantages of JVM. So JVM has a lot of cool stuff that are being offered, and you can actually use all of that. You also have the tools of the JVM and all the Java tools that can be used with JRuby. The future of JRuby, well, the JRuby team is actually working on a lot of stuff right now. What they want to do is to allow you to use all the Java profiling debugging tools in a very nice and easy way. The Java community is a rich community that has a lot of tools, and it would be great if we could really easily use them in Ruby. They also want to do a better integration with the Java stack, so stuff like Hibernate and other projects will be able to be used in a much easier way than it is right now. They want to be able to do a .java file compilation, so you'll be able to get your Ruby and compile to a .java file. Finally, they want to do a better integration with stuff like the Android and the full Java stack and stuff like that. And once they're going to get all of that, and while they're going to get all of that, they're going to work also on the performance to increase JRuby performance to be even better. Now, MacRuby. All right, well, this one, it's really hard for me to talk about because that's a project I work on and I love. So I'll try to not say it's the best project ever, but yeah. One thing that's really cool with MacRuby is the Cocoa integration. So Cocoa is, actually you should come and listen to Rich talk tomorrow. I'm sure he will explain all of that. I should not really spend too much time on that. But if you want to develop anything for OSX, MacRuby is really a nice way of doing that. There's also ahead of time compilation, which I believe MacRuby is one of the first implementations to do that. And what you can do is you can take your Ruby script or your Ruby application, and you can compile it down to a match.o file. And what that is just an executable you can click on and launch right away. So what's very interesting is you can write a video game or or a desktop application or even a web application, just compile it and then use it by just clicking on it or launching it directly. What's very interesting is if you want to write a desktop app, for instance, you can compile it and you can ship your product and people cannot see the source code. On top of that, you get all the advantages of having ahead-of-time compilation, so the startup time is better and you get great performance, which is something MacRuby really is trying to do, because the idea is that MacRuby would replace Objective-C, or would work side by side with Objective-C, so you could choose to use Objective-C to develop an application or Ruby. So they really need to get the same performance. MacRuby also supports JCD. If you use a Mac and you're on Snow Leopard, there's a system called JCD, which is Grand Central Dispatcher. I'm not going to go into that, but basically it's an awesome concept where you don't have to deal with threads anymore. You can let the system deal with all the threads, and you just send a Ruby block and you let it deal with it. It's awesome for optimization work on the server side. You also get Apple support and tools. If you ever develop an iPhone app, for instance, you have played with instruments and with Shark and all the different tools. Well, they all work with MacRuby, and they're going to work even better in the future. Talking about the future, well, I could not fit everything on the list. But one thing that I hope to see really soon, and again, it's just the future, it's just hope, is to be able to write iPhone app in Ruby. Native iPhone apps supported hopefully by Apple. Instrumentation, so you'll be able to do a full instrumentation of your apps, hopefully including remote instrumentation of your web server running and stuff like that. Better development tools. If you ever use Xcode, you know it's not the best IDE ever, and it would be great if we had something good working on the macOS platform. So I hope we'll be able to see something like that. Performance. Right now, we're not even at 1.0, and performance is already great. And the MacRuby team is working on getting it even better. I hope to be able to see MacRuby being standardized on the OS X platform as one of the normal tools that people are going to use. Hopefully, we're going to see a Linux port also, so you're going to be able to use MacRuby on Linux. You should be also able to use any C libraries. Technically, you should be able to take any C library existing and just use them with MacRuby without having to do much work. We should also support the C extensions and a lot of other stuff. Ruby News. Ruby News is the Ruby implementation that's almost all the way Ruby. So it's a very interesting approach. Evan Phoenix decided that we should, when we're a Ruby developer, we should really write our implementation in Ruby. And it's trying really hard to write as much as he can in Ruby, and they're almost there. It's a very interesting project, because almost everything is written in Ruby. You can have a full introspection. So what that means is when your app has a problem, you can actually see the full stack, and you're not limited to C. You can really analyze everything that's going on. They also support C extensions. It's not really production ready yet, but they're working hard on it. What they want to do is they want to add a ahead-of-time compiler, which is, like I explained, for MacRuby. They want to develop a very powerful debugger and real-time profiler. So that's one of the things they have in their plan. Basically, because everything is Ruby, you can really introspect things, and you can see what's going on. You can modify things while they run, and you can see the performance. And Ruby News will really give you a lot of knowledge about your stack, and that's very interesting. So that's it for the Ruby implementations and the Ruby future, the Rails future. So the big question now is, what are you going to do with all of that? And I really hope you're going to be able to take this knowledge and push it to the next level and create something great. That's it for my talk. Any questions? How does it work for the questions? You have to go on I almost put a slide for that. I'll just repeat the question. The question was, when will Rails 3 be ready? Well, if my presentation was in Spanish, I would say mañana. In English, I'll probably say as soon as possible. There's no official deadline. We've been talking about having an alpha release for the plugin developers. That should happen really soon. And my hope, and it's just me, it's nothing official, but I hope that by the end of the year, when Ruby 1.9.2 is going to be released, we're going to be able to have the Rails stack ready for that. It's getting there. There's a lot of merge going on right now. There's a lot of progress. Jose explained the generators. The rack stuff got merged in. There's a lot of work. And hopefully it's going to be really soon. Any other questions? That's it. Thank you very much.